As I walked out of that ballroom, I stopped beside the man who ran one of the largest hospital networks in Western Canada, leaned in close enough that no one else could hear, and said, "You might want to pull Dr. Mercer's research grant applications before Monday morning. All 3 of them." He looked at me. Really looked at me. Not the way people had been looking at me all night, like I was furniture that had somehow learned to walk and hold a wine glass. He looked at me the way you look at someone who just handed you a live wire. I smiled, picked up my clutch from the table, and walked out into the November cold without looking back. That was 8 months ago. Let me tell you how I got there. My husband and I met in our 2nd year at the University of Toronto. He was in medicine. I was finishing my master's in biomedical ethics, a degree that people at cocktail parties would either find fascinating or immediately change the subject after hearing about, with very little in between. We used to laugh about that together. He used to say I was the only person he'd ever met who could make hospital ethics sound like a thriller novel. His name is, well, I'll call him what he's been calling himself lately in professional circles, Dr. Henderson. My husband, the rising star of the cardiology department at Vancouver General. We had 12 years together. 12 years of building something I thought was real. When we moved from Toronto to Vancouver, it was his opportunity. His residency, his fellowship, his name on the research grants. I had a consulting practice in healthcare policy. Small, independent, the kind of work that pays well but doesn't come with business cards that impress people at galas. I took on fewer clients to support the move, then fewer still when his schedule made it clear that someone had to be home, had to manage the logistics of a life, had to be the one who remembered that our cat needed his thyroid medication and that we'd promised to call my mother-in-law every Sunday. I didn't resent any of it. Not at the time. We were a team, or so I thought. The invitation to the Vancouver Medical Foundation Gala arrived in October. It was a big deal. The foundation funds research across BC, and the annual dinner is where grants get announced, careers get boosted, and the right handshake at the right moment can change a person's trajectory for years. My husband had been nominated for a Distinguished Research Award. I bought a dress, a green one, floor-length, with a neckline that my mother would have called confident. I felt good in it. I should have paid more attention to the way his new department head, Dr. Mercer, had been re-entering our lives over the previous 6 months. She joined Vancouver General the previous spring, poached from a hospital in Calgary with the kind of compensation package that makes a statement. She was sharp, I'll give her that. Early 50s, immaculately put together. The kind of woman who makes a room rearrange itself around her when she walks in. My husband started mentioning her often. Her vision for the department. Her connections at the foundation. How she'd taken an interest in his research. I met her twice before the gala. Both times, she looked at me the way you look at something you've already decided doesn't belong in the picture. The first time, at a departmental dinner, she shook my hand and asked, "And what do you do when you're not supporting the department?" The phrasing was deliberate. When you're not supporting the department. As though my existence was defined entirely by proximity to my husband's career. I told her I worked in healthcare policy consulting. She nodded in a way that meant she had already stopped listening. The second time was at a Sunday brunch at a colleague's home. I'd been talking with another guest, a researcher at UBC, about a provincial policy shift affecting long-term care funding. I actually knew quite a bit about it. I'd written a brief for a client in that space just months before. Dr. Mercer cut into the conversation, redirected it toward my husband, and said to him with a light laugh, "You must be patient, listening to the policy side of things at home all the time." He laughed too. That was the moment I should have named what was happening. I didn't. I smoothed it over and poured myself more coffee. The night of the gala, the ballroom at the Fairmont Hotel Vancouver was everything it was supposed to be. Chandeliers, long tables dressed in white, the quiet hum of money and medicine circulating in equal measure. My husband was electric that night, genuinely happy, genuinely proud, which made everything that came after harder to hold. We found our table early. Dr. Habend, Mercer was already there, along with 3 other colleagues whose names I knew but faces I'd only seen in departmental photos on a hospital website. She greeted my husband with both hands, that particular warmth people reserve for someone they've decided is theirs to champion. She greeted me with a half smile and immediately turned away. Dinner was served. The conversation at the table moved the way it always does at these events, around me, occasionally through me, but rarely to me. I answered questions when asked, which wasn't often. Someone made a joke about golf. Someone else complained about the parking downtown. I sat beside my husband and smiled and thought about the policy brief I was supposed to be finishing that week. Then the place cards came up. I want to be precise about this because it still feels unreal when I think about it. There was a moment during dinner, during a lull between courses, when the man to my left shifted in his seat and accidentally nudged a small folded card that had been placed beside my water glass. I hadn't noticed it before. It had probably been there the whole time, folded discreetly, easy to miss. I picked it up. Inside, in neat handwriting that I now believe was Dr. Mercer's, were 5 words. Does she even have a degree? I sat with that for a moment. The table was loud. My husband was laughing at something across from him. No one was watching me. I folded the card back up and placed it in my clutch. Then I looked at Dr. Mercer. She was watching me. When our eyes met, she didn't look away. She held my gaze for exactly 1 second, and then turned to my husband and said something that made the whole table laugh. And just like that, the moment was swallowed whole. My husband noticed nothing. I want to tell you that I said something right then, that I stood up, placed the card on the table, and let the silence do the work. But I didn't. I sat through 3 more courses and a round of award presentations and the walk to the lobby afterward. My hand on my husband's arm, his attention entirely elsewhere. In the car on the way home, I told him what I'd found. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you sure it was meant for you? Maybe it was misfiled or something." It was next to my water glass. I don't want to read into things. She's been good to my career, and you know these events can get a little political. I don't want to make a thing of it. I looked out the window at the Lionsgate Bridge lights on the water. "Okay," I said. That was my mistake, not the silence, but believing that okay was good enough for either of us. He didn't come home the following 2 nights. He said there was a situation at the hospital, an emergency with a patient, that he'd be sleeping in the on-call room. It had happened before, once or twice early in his career. I didn't question it the first night. The second night, I texted a colleague of his, a resident I'd met at a department picnic the summer before, and asked casually whether the department had been dealing with a rough stretch. She replied within minutes, "Things have been quiet, actually. Pretty standard week." I sat in our kitchen in Kitsilano at 10:30 on a Tuesday night, and I understood something with the kind of clarity that arrives very quietly after a long time of not wanting to know. Here is where I need to tell you something about myself that I don't usually lead with. I spent 4 years before I met my husband working as a research assistant for a health policy think tank. Part of that work involved reviewing grant applications for federal funding, understanding where the money came from, who signed off, what the conflict of interest declarations were supposed to contain. I know that world. I know what the paperwork looks like. I know what compliance is supposed to look like, and I know what it looks like when it doesn't. When you have a quiet house, a laptop, and a reason to look, it's remarkable what is publicly accessible through the Canadian Institutes of Health Research database if you know what you're searching for. I spent 3 evenings that week looking. Dr. Mercer had filed 3 major research grant applications in the past 2 years. The primary investigator on all 3 was listed as my husband. The disclosed affiliations were accurate. The conflict of interest declarations were where things got interesting. In 2 of the 3 applications, a consulting firm was listed as a partner organization, a small firm that I could find almost no information about, incorporated in Alberta 18 months prior. The declared relationship was independent research support. Standard enough, except that the sole registered director of that consulting firm, when I traced it through Alberta's corporate registry, was a name I recognized, Dr. Mercer's daughter. It wasn't illegal on its face, but it was exactly the kind of relationship that the Foundation's ethics guidelines required to be disclosed at a much more specific level, the kind of underdisclosure that, if reviewed carefully, would trigger a formal audit. The kind of audit that puts research funding on hold. The kind of hold that ends a department head's ambitions at a major foundation pretty definitively. I documented everything carefully. I saved the registry pages. I printed the grant applications, cross-referenced the policy language, highlighted the 3 specific sections of the Foundation's conflict of interest policy that were not adequately addressed. I put it all in a folder. The kind of clear, organized presentation that comes from years of writing policy briefs for people who don't have time to untangle complexity themselves. I did not call a lawyer. I did not call my husband. I did not post anything anywhere. I called the foundation's executive director's assistant and requested a brief meeting, citing a professional matter related to the upcoming grant cycle. I gave my name and my consulting background. I got a 15-minute slot 2 days before the gala's follow-up board meeting. Then I went home, made dinner, and waited. The night of the foundation's board dinner, a smaller internal affair at the same hotel, I arrived not as a guest, but as someone who had a scheduled meeting. I wore a different dress. A gray one, understated. I carried my folder. The meeting lasted 22 minutes. The executive director was a woman in her 60s named, well, I'll leave her name out of this, who had the particular quality of very experienced administrators. She listened more than she spoke, and she asked exactly 3 questions, each one surgical. When I left her office, I could tell by the way she thanked me, formal, careful, deliberate, that what I had brought her would not be put in a drawer. The gala dinner itself was still in progress when I walked back through the lobby. I could see through the open ballroom doors, the same room from 2 weeks before, same chandeliers, same crowd. I spotted Dr. Mercer near the entrance, champagne in hand, speaking to a small group of foundation board members. She saw me. I saw her. I kept walking. But as I passed the cluster of people near the door, I caught the eye of the man beside her, the foundation's board chair, whose name I knew from years of reading healthcare policy documents, whose face I'd seen in a dozen annual report photos. He was looking at me with the mild curiosity of someone who'd been briefed that a consultant had just had a rather significant meeting upstairs. I stopped, leaned slightly toward him, said it quietly, the way you say something that doesn't need volume to land. You might want to review Dr. Mercer's grant disclosures before Monday morning, all 3 applications. I think your compliance team will find it worthwhile. He held my gaze. I gave him a small, composed smile. Then I walked out into the cold. My husband called me that Friday morning, 3 days later. He was not calling from the on-call room. He was not calling because of a patient. There's a review, he said. The foundation has put our department's grant applications under review, all 3 of them. I don't understand what's happening. I was at my desk. I had been working since 7. I had 2 client calls before noon and a policy brief due by end of day. That sounds serious, I said. Helena's Dr. Mercer's position is being reviewed too. Apparently there's a compliance question about a partner organization. That does sound like something the foundation would take seriously, I said. There was a pause. He started. I'm going to need to focus on my work right now, I said. We should talk properly when you have time to sit down. He came home that evening. He looked like a man who had been standing on what he thought was solid ground and had just felt it move. We sat at the kitchen table with the city lights of Kitsilano visible through the window, and I told him, not everything at once. I let it come out in the order that made sense, the way a proper account should. The place card. The 2 nights away. The resident who told me the hospital was quiet. The corporate registry. The folder. The meeting. He was silent for a long time. You did all of that, he finally said, while you were deciding that protecting your career was more important than protecting me, yes. He didn't have an answer for that. He looked at his hands. I thought about the man I'd met in 2nd year who used to read my ethics papers and argue with me about regulatory frameworks at midnight in the library, genuinely delighted by ideas that most people found dry. That man had been real. I believe that still. But he had allowed someone to slowly convince him that I was a supporting character in his life rather than a person with a parallel story of my own, and the moment I needed him to push back, he had chosen the path of least professional friction. That is a choice, and choices like that compound. The following weeks were not simple. A marriage of 12 years doesn't end cleanly. There were conversations that stretched past midnight, a few that I'm not proud of in terms of my own composure. One terrible Sunday afternoon in November when I sat in our car in the driveway and couldn't make myself go inside. But I also called my former supervisor at the think tank, who had moved to a senior policy role with Health Canada. I told her I was looking to re-engage my practice and had some capacity coming available. She called me back within 24 hours. I found a lawyer. I found a therapist. I found a sublet in Mount Pleasant, a one-bedroom on a quiet street near a bakery that made the kind of sourdough that genuinely makes a terrible morning slightly more bearable, and I signed the lease on a Thursday afternoon in December and sat on the empty floor afterward and cried. And then ordered Thai food, and then called my sister, and then slept better than I had in months. The foundation completed its review in January. Dr. Mercer resigned her position in February, citing personal reasons. The grant applications were resubmitted under revised authorship. My husband's name remained, but with substantially reduced scope. His career is not over. The underdisclosure was hers, not his, but the momentum he had been riding has quieted considerably. He texted me in March to ask if I would be willing to speak with him again. I said I would when I was ready. I meant it. My consulting practice is fuller now than it has been in 3 years. I've taken on 2 long-term clients in BC's long-term care sector, precisely the policy area I was talking about that Sunday brunch when Dr. Mercer redirected the conversation away from me. I gave a presentation at a healthcare policy forum in Ottawa in April. I wore the green dress. Someone asked me afterward how I had stayed so composed through the experience. I thought about it for a moment. The ballroom, the folded card, the November cold outside the Fairmont, the quiet of those 3 evenings at my kitchen table with the CIHR database open on my laptop. I just paid attention, I said. I had always paid attention. I just stopped letting other people decide what that attention was worth. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over you when you finally stop waiting for someone else to see what you already know about yourself. I remember sitting on the floor of my empty apartment in Mount Pleasant that first evening, eating pad thai out of a container and thinking, not with bitterness, but with something closer to relief, that this was the first night in years I hadn't organized my own thoughts around someone else's schedule. What Dr. Mercer did was cruel. What my husband did was quieter, and in some ways harder to name. He didn't pick up the note and throw it across the table. He didn't say anything at all, and I've come to think that the silence of people who could speak is often where the real damage lies. She wrote 5 words on a card. He spent 2 years deciding, in small increments, that her opinion of me mattered more than his own memory of who I was. But here's what I've had to sit with honestly. None of what I found in those CIHR databases would have meant anything if I hadn't spent years actually learning how that world works. The grant applications, the corporate registry, the compliance language. I could read all of it because I had put in the work long before any of this happened, long before I needed it. That's the thing about building real knowledge and real skills. You can't manufacture them in a crisis. Either you have them or you don't. I had them because I'd cared about my work for its own sake, not because I was planning some future use for it. There's a version of this story where I act out of pure anger, where I make noise at the dinner table, cause a scene, send accusatory emails to people who don't know me. That version ends badly. What I did instead was slow down, get organized, be accurate, and let the facts carry the weight. That's not a small thing. When you're humiliated, when you've just found out your husband hasn't come home for 2 nights, when a folded card with 5 dismissive words is sitting in your clutch, staying methodical takes something real. It takes a kind of self-respect that doesn't depend on anyone else's recognition to survive. I'm not telling this story to celebrate what happened to Dr. Mercer or even to what happened to my marriage. I'm telling it because I spent too long in a room where people had quietly agreed that my intelligence was decorative. And the moment I stopped accepting that agreement, the moment I acted from what I actually knew rather than from what I wished people believed about me, everything changed. The sourdough from the bakery down the street is still good, by the way. I go there most Saturday mornings now. I bring my laptop, I work on briefs, and nobody in that bakery knows or cares what my husband's title is. It's a very ordinary kind of freedom. But after 12 years of organizing my life around a narrative that wasn't mine, ordinary feels exactly right.